Welcome everyone to Start, Sit, Stash, Quit Week 12. My name is Justin Boone, the lead fantasy analyst at theScore. Appreciate everybody out there who watches these videos. And we only have 3 weeks left in the fantasy regular season, 6 weeks left if you make it to the fantasy championship. And of course, that is the goal here. So let's kick things off with some notable starts for week 12. And we've been loving this rookie class all year long, especially the quarterbacks. And Jaden Daniels definitely has a nice matchup this week. He's going against the Cowboys, but he's too obvious for this space. We can't talk about him here. So I'm going with Bo Nix, who I have just a few spots behind him, actually. And he's finished as a top 12 fantasy quarterback in 5 of his last 7 games. And his opponent this week, the Raiders, they're giving up the 7th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, including 5 top 10 weekly fantasy finishes. And that includes the game where they played Nix back in week 5. He ended up as the QB 8 on the week in that one. He accounted for 3 touchdowns in that game, 2 through the air, 1 on the ground. He's been getting it done all season long, so I expect another solid performance from Nix here. For my start at running back, we're going back to an old faithful, James Conner at the Seahawks. And Conner, he's been over 100 scrimmage yards and or a touchdown in 8 of his 10 games this season. He just keeps getting better. He's the RB10 in fantasy points per game over the last 5 weeks, and now he's coming off a bye, so he should be nice and rested for the stretch run, and that starts this week in Seattle. And the Seahawks defense, they've allowed the 11th most fantasy points to runners on the year. They've also given up at least 95 scrimmage yards to a back in 6 straight games. It's shocking, I know, but it is true. And in their last meeting back in 2023, Conner put up 150 rushing yards and 54 receiving yards and a touchdown. So expect another big stat line from Conner here. He's a strong fantasy RB1. At receiver, we'll go to the other side of the field in that game because you gotta like the recent usage for Jackson Smith-Njigba. In the first half of the season, he popped up with a couple good games, but he wasn't really a fantasy starter, kind of on the borderline there, and it really depended on the matchup. Now, the last 2 outings, we've seen his numbers spike. 7 catches for 180 yards and 2 scores on 13 targets against the Rams. And you could say, well, DK Metcalf was sidelined in that game, so that's why JSN went off. But then guess what? DK was back last week. JSN put up 110 yards on 10 grabs thanks to 11 targets. So the coaching staff is realizing the kind of playmaker he is. We're seeing them pass the baton here from Tyler Lockett to JSN. You gotta love that. And now JSN is really a younger, more talented version of Lockett in this offense. And JSN didn't have that many big games as a rookie, but one of them came against the Cardinals, had 63 yards and a touchdown. So I'm projecting him as a fantasy wide receiver 2 this week. And then at tight end, I can't believe this is where we're at, but Will Dissly versus the Ravens. And before the season, Dissly was just an afterthought for fantasy, right? He was mostly viewed as a blocking tight end in this new Chargers offense. And before that, his biggest fantasy contributions, they kind of happened when he was like a touchdown vulture with the Seahawks offense. But now he has turned into a full-blown fantasy starter, and I've talked about the Chargers offense a bunch over the last month, how they've opened up this passing attack. It's great to see. It makes a lot of sense given Justin Herbert's talent. So hats off to Jim Harbaugh. He recognized that. He is feeding it, and Dissly is coming along for the ride. He's got at least 6 targets in 4 of his last 5 outings. He was a top 8 fantasy tight end twice in that span, including last week, 80 yards and a touchdown. Now he gets a Ravens defense that's the 10th easiest matchup for fantasy tight ends on the year. And this is a game that's tied for the highest projected point total on Sunday. That means with all of the buys, with all of the injuries at the position, Will Dissly is a low-end tight end 1 for fantasy at the moment, which before the season would have been absolutely shocking to say. We can move on to sits, though. I'm shocked enough about the Dissly thing. Let's talk about some sits, and I don't think you're going to be shocked by any of these. The first is Sam Darnold against the Bears, and he's coming off an okay game against the Titans. His numbers were kind of inflated because he had a rushing touchdown, and normally that's not going to happen for him. And that was actually the first time that Darnold topped 20 fantasy points since week 4. And if we take away that first month where he was playing pretty well, Darnold just a QB 23 in fantasy points per game over the last 7 weeks. And I really don't feel great about him turning it around here against a team that's given up the fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks this season. So let's send Darnold to the bench for week 12. We could also think about benching the next guy here, Chuba Hubbard. He's facing the Chiefs, and I say think about benching because there's 6 teams on bye right now. There's some injuries out there. You're probably not going to have a better option to turn to than Chuba, but just know this is not set up to be a great spot for him. And fantasy managers, you might be expecting a lot after he posted over 20 fantasy points each of his last 2 outings, but those came in more favorable matchups against the Saints, against the Giants. This week, he's going up against the Chiefs. That is a very good run defense. They're holding running backs to the fewest fantasy points on the year. And in addition to that, we have the rookie Jonathan Brooks finally set to make his debut, and I don't expect that Brooks is going to come in and just destroy Hubbert's fantasy value, but over time, he's going to take on more of a role. He's going to be more of a threat than Miles Sanders was, especially with the Panthers not in the playoff mix. Why not give your rookie some extra snaps? Why not see what he can do? So all of this boils down to Hubbard being a low-end RB2. So I would say just keep those expectations in check. That's really all I'm trying to say here. Hubbard's still probably going to be fine in your lineup. I would also try to be realistic about Jacoby Myers for Week 12, and he's a decent fantasy starter. At least he has been since Devontae Adams left, but this is one game where I think he's going to wish that Adams was still around, because in their last few battles with the Broncos, Myers hasn't had to be that top dog in the receiving game, so he avoided a lot of the defensive attention that comes with it. Now he's going to be the guy and potentially draw a little more of Pat Surtain's coverage than usual, and this is a Broncos defense that is the toughest opponent for fantasy receivers, so even in a week with so many buys, I think Myers is just a risky wide receiver 3 flex. I would also think twice about starting Mark Andrews as your tight end this week. And Andrews did get hot for a minute there, but it wasn't because consistent yardage totals. It was really propped up by touchdowns. And last week, with Isaiah Likely returning to the lineup, Andrews' usage, it dipped back down. He had just 2 catches for 22 yards, and that's the 4th time in the last 5 games where he's been held under 45 yards. So he's really just a touchdown or bust tight end too. And the Chargers, they haven't allowed a receiving touchdown to a tight end this year. Now, we're only at the halfway mark of the video here. We still got stashes and quits to get to. And for my stashes this week, they're both guys who you could actually consider starting in deeper leagues. So the first is a rookie tight end, Jatavian Sanders on the Panthers, and he's got at least 45 yards or a touchdown in 4 of his last 5 appearances, and he plays the Chiefs this week. They're a top 5 matchup to target for fantasy tight ends. So Sanders, he is worth a stash. Let's see if he can keep this up. I know Adam Thielen's coming back. There's a lot of mouths to feed. It's not a great pass offense, but let's see if he can keep doing that. And then Nick Westbrook-Akine on the Titans. There aren't many receivers who've scored 5 touchdowns in the last 6 games. He has done it, and they were nicely spread out too. One in a bunch of different games there. So he's a usable fantasy option if you need a cheap receiver. And last week, he did hit on a long one, finished with 117 yards and a score. His schedule, one of the easiest out there for receivers the rest of the way. So you could actually do worse than Westbrook-Akine, either on your bench or in your flex spot. Now, if you need to make a little room for those guys, I hate to say this, but I think we can quit on Dalton Kincaid. Maybe you could put him in your IR spot while he's on bye. That would be fine, but he didn't make it back for that Chiefs game last week. He's dealing with the knee injury. Now he's on bye. We don't have a timeline for his return, and when he does come back, he's got some tough matchups. He's got the Niners and the Lions in weeks 13 and 15, and overall, he just really hasn't been connecting on his opportunities. So if there's a Jonnu Smith or a Hunter Henry or a Will Disley like we talked about earlier, I'd be dropping Kincaid for those guys. I'd also be willing to drop Tyler Lockett. And this goes back to the Jackson Smith and Jigba conversation that we had. JSN coming on. You know, it's at the expense of Lockett, who's been held to 4 targets or less in 3 straight games now. He could still have value if DK Metcalf or if JSN get hurt, but we're not banking on that, so I would let Lockett go at this point. And sadly, you got to let me go here because that is all for Start, Sit, Stash, Quit this week. But get over to theScore, check out all my content there, like my rankings, my trade value charts, my waiver wire column. You should also download and listen to the theScore Fantasy Football Podcast if you haven't already. And if you're here, you should be hitting that subscribe button below. Make sure you're getting all the football videos we're putting out on the No Timeouts YouTube channel every week.